On the afternoon of April 13, 1945, Washington felt unusually quiet. Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. The man who had guided America through Depression and global war was gone, and in his place stood Harry S. Truman, a president almost no one had expected to lead the free world. The flags outside government buildings hung low, but inside the White House the air was tense rather than mournful. There was no time to grieve. Europe was still at war. Armies were still moving. Decisions still carried consequences measured in lives. In a narrow corridor near the cabinet room, a small group of army officers waited to brief the new president. They spoke in low voices, shifting their weight, glancing at their watches. Each of them knew the facts of the briefing by heart. German defenses were collapsing, Allied forces were advancing, and the war in Europe was entering its final phase. But beneath the statistics and maps, something else lingered. A single name hovered over the room, unspoken but unavoidable. It was the name they all knew the president would ask about the moment he sat down. George S. Patton. Even far from the front lines, Patton's reputation filled space. It carried triumph and unease in equal measure. His victories were undeniable, his energy unmatched, but his temperament had long made Washington nervous. As the door to the cabinet room opened and Truman stepped inside, the officers straightened. He looked calm, but only hours into his presidency, he was still absorbing the weight of what he had inherited. The briefing would begin as expected, but everyone in that room understood that sooner or later, the conversation would turn to Patton. And when it did, nothing about the future would feel simple again. To understand why that moment mattered, one had to understand who Patton was to America in 1945. He was not merely a general. He was a symbol. To his soldiers, Patton was electrifying. He spoke with confidence, demanded excellence, and pushed men beyond what they believed they could endure. His Third Army had torn through France with a speed that stunned both enemies and allies. He seemed to thrive on motion, on pressure, on the clarity of combat. On the battlefield, his instincts were often brilliant. He saw opportunities others missed and acted without hesitation. This made him dangerous to the enemy and invaluable to commanders who needed results. But those same qualities unsettled the political leadership. Patton spoke as freely as he fought. He made blunt remarks, expressed controversial opinions, and showed little patience for diplomatic language. Where others measured their words, Patton charged ahead. His statements carried weight not because he held political office, but because he was famous, respected, and listened to. Every sentence he uttered risked becoming a headline. Every opinion had the potential to echo far beyond the battlefield. To soldiers, this made him authentic. To politicians, it made him unpredictable. Washington could tolerate risk in war. Peace, however, demanded caution, and Patton was not a cautious man. Harry Truman understood caution. Before becoming president, he had built his reputation on discipline and order. He valued clear chains of command and believed deeply in civilian control of the military. Truman respected strength, but he also respected restraint. Now suddenly, he had access to information that few men on Earth possessed. He learned of secret agreements with allies, of delicate arrangements that held the wartime coalition together, and of a weapon so powerful it could reshape the future entirely. The atomic bomb was no longer a rumor to him, it was a responsibility. He also learned how fragile the alliance with the Soviet Union truly was. Beneath the surface of cooperation lay suspicion, ambition, and fear. In this world, leadership meant more than winning battles. It meant preventing the next one. Truman saw his role not as a commander charging forward, but as a guardian of stability. This shaped how he viewed men like Patton. He did not question Patton's courage or ability. What concerned him was whether those qualities could exist safely outside of war. Patton's clarity in combat was undeniable, but clarity without restraint could become recklessness in diplomacy. Truman did not yet dislike Patton. In truth, he had not fully formed an opinion of him at all. What he felt instead was unease. A sense that their instincts pointed in different directions. As the briefing began, Truman listened carefully. The officers spoke of collapsing German lines, of advancing Allied units, of a war nearing its end. Truman asked questions, absorbing details, nodding thoughtfully. Then, almost casually, He asked the question the room had been bracing for. Where does General Patton stand on all this? For a moment, no one answered. The officers exchanged glances, measuring their words. Finally, one of them spoke. Patton, he explained, remained aggressive in his thinking. He believed Germany was finished, but he was deeply concerned about Soviet intentions. Truman leaned back slightly. Concerns about the Soviets were not new, but hearing them attached so directly to Patton caught his attention. Truman asked for clarification. The officer hesitated before continuing. Patton, he said, believed peace might not last. That the alliance formed to defeat Hitler could fracture sooner than anyone wanted to admit. The room grew quiet. Then came the sentence that would linger long after the briefing ended. General Patton believes peace will not hold. Truman did not respond immediately. He thanked the officers and ended the meeting, but the words stayed with him. Peace will not hold. In that moment, the tension between two visions of leadership became clear. One forged in war, the other preparing for peace. And though no decision had been made, something had already begun. In the weeks that followed that first briefing, Truman began doing what he trusted more than any public opinion or second-hand summary. He read. Quietly, methodically, often late into the night, he worked his way through General George S. Patton's full personnel file. It was thick, far thicker than most. Page after page documented extraordinary battlefield success, rapid advances, decisive maneuvers, victories achieved with speed that bordered on audacity. Interspersed among those achievements were commendations praising Patton's leadership and his ability to inspire exhausted men to keep moving when others would have stalled. But the file did not stop there. It never did. There were reports of controversies that had followed Patton from North Africa to Europe. The slapping incident appeared in stark language, stripped of emotion but heavy with implication. There were transcripts of public remarks that had caused discomfort in Washington long before Truman took office. Truman read them all without comment. When he finished, he leaned back and said quietly to an aide, almost to himself, that a man could win a war and still not know how to manage the peace. It was not a condemnation. It was an observation. And it lingered. At first, Truman chose not to intervene. Germany surrendered. Celebrations swept across the United States, and the public mood turned from fear to relief almost overnight. But inside the administration, the focus shifted instantly to occupation and reconstruction. It was here, in the details of peace, that Patton's voice began to create friction. Reports crossed Truman's desk summarizing Patton's comments to journalists and subordinates about denazification. Patton argued that many German administrators, even those with prior Nazi Party membership, were necessary to keep cities functioning. Without experienced officials, he warned, chaos would follow. Truman read the cable slowly. Removing former Nazis from positions of authority was not merely a policy choice. It was the moral foundation of Allied legitimacy. To question it publicly was to undermine the justification for the occupation itself. Truman did not explode. He did not issue a public rebuke. He placed the paper down and stared at it for a long moment. Then he asked a simple question of his military liaison. Did General Patton understand the implications of what he was saying? The answer came carefully. Yes, sir. He understands them. He simply disagrees. That distinction mattered. This was not ignorance. It was defiance of policy, spoken aloud by a man whose reputation amplified every word. To Truman, this crossed a line. Opinions held privately were one thing. Statements that weakened Allied unity were another. Patton's remarks were no longer just personal views. They were becoming political weapons, whether he intended them to be or not. As weeks passed, the consequences widened. British officials raised concerns through diplomatic channels, noting that Patton's comments complicated their own efforts to stabilize occupied zones. French leaders, already struggling with fragile governments and internal divisions, worried that such statements emboldened elements resistant to reform. Most troubling of all, intelligence reports indicated that Soviet newspapers were quoting Patton selectively, using his words to argue that the United States was soft on fascism and unreliable as an occupying power. Truman understood then how quickly words traveled in the post-war world. A comment made in Bavaria could reshape perceptions in London, Paris, and Moscow within days. Intent no longer mattered as much as impact. Damage spread faster than explanation. Despite this, Truman still hesitated. He did not want to act on impulse. He wanted perspective. That perspective came, cautiously, from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's assessment arrived in the form of a measured, respectful letter. He praised Patton's unparalleled battlefield record and his loyalty to the mission. But he did not ignore the growing problem. Patton's statements, Eisenhower wrote, were becoming a distraction. They complicated relations with allies and undermined the cohesion that had won the war. Eisenhower did not demand Patton's removal. He did not dramatize the situation. That restraint made the message heavier, not lighter. Truman read the letter twice. He understood what Eisenhower was saying without it being said directly. Patton's presence was becoming untenable. Still, Truman waited. He admired Patton's courage. He admired his refusal to bend when he believed something was wrong. Those qualities resonated with Truman more than he admitted publicly. But admiration did not erase responsibility. Every day he delayed, more memos arrived. Some described minor disputes with occupation officials. Others detailed sharp exchanges with Allied representatives. None alone demanded decisive action. Together, they formed a pattern. Truman felt the weight of it growing. Removing a national hero was not just a policy decision. It was a moral one. It risked public backlash. It risked demoralizing soldiers who saw Patton as a symbol of victory. And yet, keeping him in place risked something even greater: the stability of the peace Truman was charged with building. Privately, Truman struggled. He paced. He reread reports. He asked for additional evaluations from officers who worked closely with Patton. The conclusions were consistent. Patton was not disloyal. He was not incompetent. He was simply incompatible with the demands of the moment. Truman understood then the cruel irony of leadership. The very traits that made Patton indispensable in war made him dangerous in peace. Delay no longer felt like caution. It felt like avoidance. And avoidance, Truman knew, was itself a decision. By the time he set the files aside, the question was no longer whether action would be taken. It was how long he could postpone what was becoming inevitable. The moment Truman finally confronted the issue did not come with raised voices or dramatic confrontation. It came in a quiet meeting, late in the summer of 1945, with a handful of senior advisors seated around a table covered in folders and notes. Truman listened as they summarized the latest reports, the latest reactions from allies, the latest consequences of Patton's words. When they finished, Truman asked a single question. It was not framed with anger or accusation. It was measured, almost clinical. Is he helping the mission, he asked, or is he hurting it? No one answered immediately. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. No one needed to speak. The answer was already there, heavy and unavoidable. In that silence, Truman made his decision. There would be no public announcement, no spectacle, no attempt to shame a man who had helped win a war. The choice would be handled quietly, with as much dignity as the moment allowed. Patton received the order without protest. Those present later said he stood still, his face tight, his expression controlled. He nodded once and said only very well. There was no outburst, no dramatic refusal. Yet those who knew him understood what had been taken away. Patton had been built for motion, for command, for the clarity of enemy and objective. Now he was left without a battlefield, without a role that matched his instincts. For the first time in years, his energy had nowhere to go. Truman, meanwhile, felt a weight he had not anticipated. He had made decisions involving weapons, alliances, and entire nations, but this one felt different. It felt personal, even though it was not meant to be. Removing Patton from command carried the quiet sorrow of ending something necessary but deeply regretted. What Truman really thought of Patton was never hatred. It was never jealousy. It was recognition. Truman saw in Patton a rare kind of greatness, the kind forged under pressure and revealed in moments of chaos. He admired Patton's courage, his clarity, his refusal to hesitate when action was required. But Truman also understood the limits of that greatness. The world he now governed demanded restraint, patience, and balance. Patton had been shaped by war, and war rewarded decisiveness above all else. Peace did not. To Truman, Patton was not wrong. He was simply out of place. A man whose instincts were perfect for one moment in history and dangerous in the next. In time, some of Patton's warnings would seem prophetic. The tensions he sensed hardened into the Cold War. Truman would spend his presidency navigating. Through doctrines, alliances, and economic rebuilding, Truman shaped a response to the very dangers Patton had feared, but through containment rather than confrontation. Two instincts, different but necessary, shaped the post-war world in their own ways. So what would you have done in Truman's position? Was Patton ahead of his time, or too volatile for peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more.